Hi, my name is Mike Trout, and in 2010 I started working on the idea of a decentralized startup, which I called the Foundup. Now, why on earth would I want to start a decentralized startup? Well, I had been doing startups for over 10 years by 2010, and what I realized, and I was one of the first people to start pounding the whole idea that over 99% of startups fail. And it was my opinion was like, wow, if there's such a high failure rate, what's wrong with it and how would I fix it? Well, that's what led me to the idea of basically decentralized startups that I call Foundups, because one of the big problems with the startup is they're a centralized vehicle, and in order for them to succeed, have to either have luck or access to capital networks, or actually have, an idea that just happens to take off, like Facebook, which start off as kind of like, I like, I don't like, I like, I don't like. And because you have that luck, all of a sudden the masses jump onto it, all of a sudden the closed capital networks jump onto it, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're a billionaire. And as a result of that, you act like you're a genius or something, when in fact all you did was create, an app that was timely and that people liked. There's nothing genius about it. Unfortunately, innovators and creators like myself who see solutions to problems that necessarily don't have the scalability factor that some of these startups have, and thus are ignored and become a bigger problem and issue. So how can we motivate people, for example, in California to pick up citrus fruit that's laying on the side of the road and turn it into a jam or a product or a cleaner that they can sell? Well, there's no stakeholder in the form of a traditional investor that's going to basically invest in that, because there's no scalability to it. There's something in startups called compounded annual growth rate, CAGR. And CAGR is basically this insane notion that you're going to basically have this exponential growth, and as a result of this exponential growth, on a planet with finite resources, that it is kind of endless. And at some point you'll exit out of this, you'll come in early, or exit out, and you'll take your money out. There's so many problems with the startup. And most of these problems, what people don't realize, actually came out during basically when startups started. You could say started the Industrial Revolution is when the idea of startups and investing into these ideas, whether it was the railroad or anything else, occurred. And ultimately, the idea of limited resources and our ability to basically remove 95% of the large fish out of the oceans, to drive tigers in the course of 100 years from over 100,000 to under 4,000, was this absurd notion. And what I have been saying, and what people need to understand, is that every crisis facing our planet, barring some pandemics and obviously natural disasters, can be traced to our business model, and that business model being the startup business model. It's a selfish, centralized, top-down business model that looks out for the interests of a few stakeholders at the sacrifice of everyone else. And as I started looking at the problem with the startup in 2010, I realized what we needed was a decentralized vehicle. And in order to have a decentralized vehicle, we need to do all these different things. Well, I started to talk to a small group called Small Planet, and they were a bunch of Bitcoin developers. And some of those guys went on to be some of the founders of Ethereum. And my talks with them was basically talking about the whole need to have organizations built into this and entities so an idea can ultimately scale up into an entity that is ultimately decentralized and run by the stakeholders, and that all the stakeholders have voting. Well, if you're into Ethereum, this is what's known as decentralized autonomous organizations or even decentralized autonomous corporations. This is something that I was talking about this small group of folks back in 2010 and 11, back before Ethereum wasn't even around, because I was trying to convince them to build something called the Open Innovation Framework. Ethereum is the open innovation framework that we need to bring about decentralized and not decentralized launch platform. And what's really important to understand is we cannot turn off the startup. We just can't turn it off and say, you know what, we can't have a business model built on Kaggle, because ultimately what's going to happen then is it's going to collapse our markets and everything else. But what we can do is introduce a business model in parallel using Ethereum. So how would this model look like, and how would you go about launching this model? Well, the first thing we would do is set up what's known as a Foundups DOC, which is a decentralized autonomous DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. Now, recently, someone set one up, and it wasn't coded out. There's a lot of gray areas, and they put a lot of effort, and it got hacked, and they lost a lot of money, or a hacker tried to take a bunch of money out. I'm not sure how they fixed that, but I know they will fix it. And it was good that it happened now than later, because ultimately it provides us with an avenue to fix it. But the first thing what we need to do is set up this fund. This fund for Foundups, a DAO, a distributive autonomous organization for launching Foundups. Once we have that set up, then what we'll do is we'll set up an app, or allow anyone to code apps for Foundups to tap into this fund in order to launch their ideas. Now, I have spent considerable time designing and developing something called the Ethereum Play Foundups app. And in this app, ideas basically level up to a point where they actually become their own autonomous organizations, or they become basically a subsidiary of the parent. So as these ideas level up, and there's different components to the idea, I put my idea up, hey, I want to do this up. The first thing that the validation is, will anyone put their tokens into this idea? So when you set up a distributive DAO, or DAOC, a distributed autonomous organization or corporation, basically the person gets tokens back for putting ether into this fueling. Ether is fuel. Then the person can select and say, hey, you get so many tokens for your ether. Maybe it's 100 to 1, maybe it's 1,000 to 1. You can then take these tokens, and you can call these tokens whatever you want. You call them Foundup dollars. These Foundup dollar tokens, and you put them into the various different Foundup ideas that people have. And ultimately then, as these ideas go through specific metrics, and the metrics be, number one, will people put tokens into, that's your first metric. That's the first validation. Someone puts a token in it, hey, it's validated. Hey, I like what Mike's doing, I'm going to put a token in it in exchange for a stake. So again, so it kind of works like this. You have the ether, you put in the ether, it creates tokens. Tokens then, which are Foundup dollars, go into that thing and they get staked. Depending on how early they put their token or their Foundup dollars into that Foundup, and as it validates, that's valuation. So the stake of the Foundup increases as it passes through these very specific metric valuations, to a point when the decision is, hey, it has been successful, and the decision is made by the token holders, or the stakeholders, and ultimately then what happens is the Foundup then rolls out into its own entity, and what happens then is all the folks that hold tokens are rewarded. Now, the cool thing about the way that Foundups work is, as you go through these validation milestones, all right, these metrics, you can always exit out, and you can sell your token or your Foundup dollar or your stake, right, to others and who want to get in, because there's only a finite amount of think of it, Foundup dollars per entity. So, or another word to think of it is Foundup number of stakes. So, a Foundup. So let's recap that, because I know I'm mismatching some of the terms because I haven't talked about it in a while. So, right. So to clarify it again, is you set up this entity where people put in Ether. Ether then is exchanged for tokens. These tokens then are placed into Foundups, and in exchange for those Foundups, right, they're actually given a stake. So then what happens is the person who owns these stakes can actually buy and sell these stakes throughout the transition. Obviously, the earlier you get into a Foundup, right, and as that Foundup reaches a specific milestone, it may stall, and the stake may be sit there, and you're like, hey, I don't see it going anywhere else. I'm going to pull my stake out and put it somewhere else. Well, you can do that. And what happens then is there becomes a marketplace for these Foundup ideas that are built into our Play Foundups app. Not only that, there's an interesting thing that happens, and once the Foundup basically reaches let's say it reaches a point where the final stage is what I call an open public offering. At an open public offering, what happens is basically all of the stakes are basically transferred into actual shares of that corporation, because that's the transition when a Foundup idea actually becomes a legal entity. It becomes it becomes the Google, it becomes the Facebook. Until then, it's just a project of. So really, what we're dealing with is just fueling these projects until they get to a validation period. And that validation is done through an open public offering. So an OPO is basically when folks who have, whoever has these stakes, all of a sudden these stakes become shares. People who didn't have a chance to participate in the Foundup, all of a sudden now has an opportunity to basically buy into it like an IPO. But it's not an IPO, because how an IPO works is you've got to be a part of a hedge fund, you got to be part of all this stuff. Well, with an OPO, it's completely decentralized, it's completely public. So you have to think of Foundups as we are creating a completely new business model that ultimately has some links to the old business model, but those old links are only because the new links don't exist at this time, and we're kind of like, wiring the two together. But ultimately, everything that exists in the what I call the Open Innovation Framework is built on Ethereum and built on all the different things that now exist. So the opportunity now is to move forward with Foundups, and I'm looking for your help. If you are a developer, if you are interested in helping to fuel the DOC, if you're helping to code it out, someone who understands the problems of what happened through the hack, and we need to be very careful not to allow basically an abuse to happen, and we have to code it in a specific way in order that only Foundups that are qualified and that can access. So this will be a fund that will not be initially accessible right now, except for you can put money into it to help vest it. So if you have Ether to invest, you'd like to participate in this, I'd love to have you part of it. If you have questions, you can Skype me at Foundup, and or call me at 202-656-6012 to discuss it in greater detail. If you're an investor looking to participate, I'd love to talk to you too. Ultimately, there's a lot of work to do, and I'm reaching out to you to hopefully be part of what we're doing. Thanks.